All right, so here we are in module number 8, Introduction to Biodiversity. So our learning goals for this module are to identify how biodiversity exists at different scales, explain how biodiversity affects responses to environmental stressors, and describe how we can calculate biodiversity, and finally describe how we estimate the number of species on Earth. So, identifying how biodiversity exists at different scales, it exists on 4 scales: genetics, species, habitat, and ecosystem. Each 4 is very important to the health of any ecosystem. So, genetic diversity is a measure of the genetic variation among individuals in a population. When I think of this, I think of all the different types of dogs that there are. So, they're all considered dogs, but you have everything from Chihuahuas to Pit Bulls to St. Bernards, and how genetically different they are, even though they're the same species. For species diversity, I always think of a household. So in my house, I have fish and I have dogs, and then obviously my wife and I. So we have 3 different species living in the house in just a particular region or ecosystem. Um, at a farm, you'd have horses and cows and sheep and people and dogs and cats and ducks and chickens, and so that'd be a pretty diverse species for that particular region. We have habitat diversity. That's the variety of habitats that exist in a given ecosystem. So even if we just did the Capital City High School campus, so if you walk down to the baseball fields, there's a little creek, which would be its own habitat of frogs, maybe some little fishes, some different bacteria, some water plants, algae. And then you walk up just a little bit, and we have those fields that have a lot of grasses in them. Those grasses, if you walk by them in the springtime, are just covered in grasshoppers and crickets and different types of bugs. And so, just even on our own campus, we have a lot of habitat diversity with that. And then finally, we have ecosystem diversity. That's the variety of ecosystems that exist in a given region. Living in Missouri, we actually have quite a bit of different ecosystems. So we have our rivers and creeks and ponds. We have our rolling hills and our prairies. We have our mountainscapes down in southern Missouri. So we have a lot of actually ecosystem diverse areas just in our given state, which is pretty lucky. Okay, so the population bottleneck, it's pretty interesting concept. So a large population might have higher genetic diversity, but then if there is a sudden event where the population declines rapidly, the survivors may not represent as much genetic information as the original group. So, for example, if you think about the wildfires in California, if there was like a big population of squirrels or birds and a lot of them got caught, but only maybe 5 of them survived the fires, then their genetic diversity is gone down significantly, and they're not a best representation of all of the critters that lived there. Now we're on to explain how biodiversity affects the response of environmental stressors. So, with the habitats that are different species will have different adaptations, right? So, deers don't have gills and fish don't have feet. So, you're going to be hopefully best adapted to your different habitat. With that, we have some species that we consider specialists, and they can only live within a certain range of factors. An example that's listed here is koalas. They only live in Australia, and the reason being is that that's one of the only places that eucalyptus is grown, and that's their diet. So if they moved anywhere else, they would have to adapt to something else, and that's probably not going to happen. So specialists again they have certain parameters they have to live in. So you wouldn't put a saltwater fish in a freshwater fish tank, right? Other species can be generalists and they have a wide range of factors they can live in. So, for example, dogs or white-tailed deer here, they are all over the North, Central, and South America. We have them all over the place: Canada, United States, Mexico, and they're adapted to their very different situations. Generalists can survive a lot of different conditions, like I said, and so they are usually a good test on how well the ecosystem is doing. And then specialists are an even better test because they can tell you if the ecosystem is healthy, because those organisms will be thriving in that area. So each form of diversity has an example of high and low consequences. And so um, if you have high genetic variability in your ecosystem, then you're going to be less um, susceptible to disease. So COVID, right? So some of us were asymptomatic, some of us had very bad symptoms, and some of us had mild symptoms in between. And that's due to genetic differences. So myself, there's no way I didn't get COVID, but I never felt any of the effects from it. Whereas you guys might know some people who had very bad effects or even passed away from that. And so that's a good example of genetic variance being a good thing in human populations because it means that we'll be able to survive a lot of things. High consequences of species diversity as the ecosystem responds well to disturbances. So, like the example I gave earlier for wildfires, the more different species you have there, the better they're going to be able to rebound after trying to change it. One of the consequences from the wildfires in Colorado was they had a big mudslide, and that mudslide really messed up their river systems. And so, for a long time, it was taking a while for the fish to come back, but they have high diversity of fish species that live in like the Poudre River system, and so they were able to come back pretty well. If you don't have high species diversity, likely if something happens like a hurricane or a volcano or a storm that really does a lot of damage, your ecosystem will probably collapse because there's nothing that will be able to live there. High habitat diversity, you're going to see a higher number of different species. So hopefully that means it is a little bit healthier. So like Cap City, we have bugs. Bugs feed frogs, right? Fish also feed frogs. Bugs feed birds, right? So having different habitats means you can support more species in a given area. And then high ecosystem diversity, again, that's just kind of a good result of having the other three. So if you have high diversity of ecosystems, that means you're going to have a high diversity of habitats, which means you're probably going to have a high diversity of species, which means you're going to have a high genetic diversity within those species because you just have a lot of them. So it means that your ecosystem or your biome is going to be pretty healthy because it's going to be more resistant if there's a big change. So some scientists did a study in the, find it here, in the Minnesota grassland, and they were manipulating how the number of different plant species affected the number of herbivores and carnivores or predators. And so this graph is a little confusing, so probably a good idea to break it down. So the number of plant species is not actually these. The number of plant species is literally just 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16. And the number of herbivores, or the species richness, so how many different species there were, are actually these dots. So when they only had one plant species there, they had just over 2.8 average different species living there. And you can see as they increase the plant diversity, the herbivore diversity also increased because there's more food to eat, right? And then the same thing over here. So this is predators or carnivores, right? So again, we can see the more that we increase our different types of plants, the higher our diversity of carnivores gets because it means that there's more food to go around because there's more diversity. So then 8.3, describe how we can calculate biodiversity. Scientists developed two measures of biodiversity. The first one is species richness, and that's the number of different species in a given area, and then species evenness, so the relative proportion of individuals within the species of a given area. And so hopefully you have done the pre-lab for the lab to introduce this module or this chapter, and you've kind of seen how that looks. So species richness, again, I would say, like for my house, I have 3 different species living here, the same type of fish, my wife and I, and my dogs, right? So three species. And species evenness would be the relative proportion. So I have about 25 fish living here, 3 dogs and 2 people. So it would not be super even because we're very outnumbered by the fish. Here's a good visual example of that. So we have species A, B, C, and D, and if you count them all up, one, two, three, four, 5, and then we did D 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, B 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then finally A 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that is species even, right? And then this is would be an uneven species, but they would still have the same species richness because there's 4 different ones, but the evenness would not be the same. So if something happened to where these trees, looks like A is our biggest percent, had some sort of parasite that only infected these trees, then our ecosystem here would be less sustainable and probably susceptible to being taken out or collapsing. So then 8.4, describe how estimating the number of species, describe how we estimate the number of living species on Earth. So the estimated species is a challenge for some of those reasons. It is just hard to find these animals, or organisms rather, hard to find them. How do we even track the number? Are they too small to be found with the naked eye? Can we even get there? So, for example, like Marianas Trench is just like impossible to get to because of the pressure that you have down in that deep in the ocean. Is the area really secluded? So some of the islands are hard to get to by boat, and so they might not be able to count all the species that live there. There's a big amount of organisms called protozoa that are really hard to count and find because they're small, and so they could be in the millions, and we don't really know because we can't see them, so we don't really know where to find them. Are we looking for things at the right times? Are these animals nocturnal? Is it harder to count them when they're nocturnal because you can't see, but having light in there make it harder to find, that sort of thing. So it's very difficult to estimate the number of species that is living on the earth at any given time. So to date, there are about 2 million species that have been named, but every year we discover 15 to 18,000 more. The estimated total number of species on Earth is between 5 million and 100 million. So you can see that is a pretty big range. For as much as we know about the Earth, I think that we also don't know twice as much. And so that is your Module 8. Hopefully that was helpful in answering your review questions. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me in class, as well as you can send me an email. Thank you.